This channel is part of the History Hit network.
Anyone familiar with East Anglia will recognise this virtually treeless, flat landscape, which is the Fens. It's difficult now to believe that a mere 400 or 500 years ago, this was covered in water, or at least treacherous marshes. The lack of towns and villages is perhaps the best indication of the Fens' historical past.
There are few areas of the kingdom which are least likely to have any connection with the crown, and yet there are some surprising associations. Indeed, it was the influence of the crown which was largely responsible for the shaping of this part of the country. For centuries, the Fens have provided a natural boundary between the ancient kingdoms of Mercia and Anglia. Now, while both embraced early Christianity and built churches, the Angles seem to excel, and perhaps the most famous rises above the landscape in a spectacular fashion. Ely Cathedral.
Nicknamed the Ship of the Fens, its unique lantern tower is a welcome sight for the lost or weary traveller. However, long before the tower was conceived, the Isle of Ely was the setting for an extraordinary resistance struggle.
The only way to reach the Isle was either by boat or along one of the few strips of solid land or causeways like this one. While such knowledge was common in the area, outsiders had to rely on locals to guide them.
When William, Duke of Normandy, invaded in 1066 and killed Harold at Hastings, it was only the beginning of his campaign to conquer England. Being crowned was one thing, convincing his subjects that he was king, quite another. Just how long that actually took is illustrated here at Ely. For 5 years, Ely remained unconquered. It formed the perfect refuge for a semi-mythical figure who led a stubborn resistance to the Norman invaders. He was called Hereward the Wake. One of Hereward's actions actually took place some 26 miles from Ely at Peterborough. The Norman abbot, sent to replace the former Saxon one, arrived with his army to be met by Hereward and his followers. The ensuing battle left the old church badly damaged. William's forces tried to besiege the Isle of Ely, but that proved to be futile, as Hereward's knowledge of the Fens allowed him to move about with ease.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. We've got unrivaled access to the world's leading historians, with hundreds of documentaries featuring everything from Boudica to the British royal family. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Real Royalty fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use code REALROYALTY at checkout.
The Normans decided to take the place by force by building their own causeway. The first one sank, and the second one was set on fire by the defenders. Who knows how long this resistance may have carried on had Hereward not been betrayed.
The abbot of Ely began to get extremely nervous about what might happen to him, his monastery and the inhabitants if the Normans succeeded in getting in. So he arranged for one of his monks to make contact with the Norman camp at Cambridge. In the middle of the night, the monk led William's army to the causeway and safely across the Fens. At first light, they marched into the town, taking the defenders completely by surprise.
Strangely, while the abbey was forced to pay a severe fine to William, who confiscated its lands, it seems that the town and even Hereward escaped punishment.
Long before the days of Hereward, the monastery at Ely had been founded by a Saxon princess, Etheldreda, the daughter of the King of the Angles.
Etheldreda was a member of a royal family, an East Anglian princess, a very strong-minded lady. I think she must have been. I know Sylvia differs in her opinion, but I reckon that she was a bit of a battle axe, because somebody who could be married twice, insist on a brother-sister relationship twice, avoid a warring husband who wanted her back, that was the second marriage, and still managed to get her own way. I think at that time that was an incredible, incredible feat. And I suppose it was so novel, a princess wanting to become a nun, and she made it. So, yes, I see her as a bit of a devout battle axe.
And you don't agree?
I don't agree with that, actually. I certainly think that she was strong, and I think if she'd been a lady in the 20th century, she would have been very much an independent woman. She always wanted to be a nun, but for political reasons, she had to be married off, and so the first person she had to marry was Tombert, and he apparently was a lot older than her. And because she knew she wanted to be a nun and lead a religious life, even at a young age, probably about 15 or so, she asked that the contract be made, that she didn't fulfill the conjugal rights of the marriage. And apparently this was agreed. And when Tombert died, she actually inherited this land here. And she decided that she would like to live here and found her convent here. But it didn't last very long, because she was then requested to marry the Prince of Northumbria, which was Egfrith. Now, her second husband was only 15 when she married him, and she was probably nearer 30. But he wanted her to fulfill her conjugal rights later on in life, and he actually went to Bishop Wilfrid and said, who was her confessor, would you please ask Etheldreda to fulfill her marriage obligations? And Wilfrid upheld her desire to be a nun. And so Egfrith had to allow it, or he did allow it for a time. And then after a while he decided against it, and he tried to make her come back and be his queen. But she ran away from this and then came back to Ely and found a monastery. And in fact, she founded a double monastery. There were men and women.
She was buried in the nuns' graveyard, but so many people wanted to visit the grave so soon after her death that her sister had her body removed into the cathedral church. And when they opened up the coffin, they found that her body was perfectly preserved, whereas they'd expected to find just nothing but bones. And the doctor who attended her at her death was absolutely amazed at the preservation of the body. And of course that spread and confirmed, if you like, sainthood or God's intervention. And Ely then became the great pilgrimage centre visited by thousands and thousands of people.
The whole cathedral, built on the site of the monastery, was designed as a fantastic structure to house the shrine to St. Etheldreda, which throughout the Middle Ages attracted hundreds and thousands of pilgrims.
Extra wide windows were built above Etheldreda's tomb so the sunlight would flood in. The spot is still marked today, even though the original shrine was destroyed at the dissolution. Perhaps the most famous feature of Ely is the incredible lantern. The original Norman tower collapsed in 1322, and the building of this gravity-defying wooden structure was then started. As the English church under Henry VIII broke away from Rome, Ely suffered less than many places from reforming zeal. The destruction of statues, carvings and windows took place in the Lady Chapel, and St Etheldreda's shrine was completely destroyed.
Other cathedrals were not so fortunate. Peterborough, for instance, suffered far worse damage during this time, but thankfully, one or two features survived.
If this fan vaulting seems familiar, then it's because it was designed by John Wastell, who went on to build King's College Chapel in Cambridge. This magnificent ceiling in the nave is the largest surviving medieval painted ceiling in Europe. It's difficult to believe, but Roundhead soldiers actually tried to shoot it out with their muskets. Perhaps more surprising still is that Peterborough was the burial place for not one, but two queens. The first to be buried here was Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. When she was just 15, Catherine married Henry's older brother, Arthur, but after just 4 months, Prince Arthur died, whereupon his younger brother, Henry, proposed he marry Catherine.
She steadfastly maintained that the marriage had never been consummated. And when Henry VII died, the two were married in St. Paul's in 1509, and the Spanish ambassador wrote, and I don't see any reason for him to lie, and he said that it was a love match. She truly loves the king, and he is devoted to her. But then they had a series of tragedies, really, over children. Altogether, she bore 6 children, and only one of them survived. And the one that survived was a girl, and from his point of view, a girl didn't count. Because she was unable to produce a male heir, Henry became more and more restive. And there's no doubt that Henry also had a roving eye. He'd had a number of mistresses. He'd had illegitimate children, one of whom was Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, but he couldn't possibly ascend to the throne, and he needed a legal male heir. And so he came to the position that he had to get rid of Catherine in order to marry someone else. He fell in love with Anne Boleyn, and Anne Boleyn said she wasn't going to be his mistress, it was queen or nothing, and so he was in something of a dilemma.
Although Henry is famous for having 6 wives, he actually spent more than half his adult life, 20 years in fact, married to Catherine. But with the king marrying Anne Boleyn, Catherine needed to be moved further away from court. In 1533, she was virtually in exile at Buckton Towers near Huntingdon, where, much to Henry's chagrin, she enjoyed tremendous popularity. An incensed Henry sent the Duke of Suffolk to move her elsewhere. Catherine refused and sealed the door against him, insisting she could only be removed by force. An angry crowd of villagers gathered in support of the former queen, carrying scythes and billhooks. Suffolk felt sufficiently intimidated. He withdrew. Despite being banished from court, Catherine remained loyal to the king to the end, even writing a letter to Henry forgiving him for his actions. But she saved probably her most powerful phrase to the very end.
The most amazing words, mine eyes desire to see thee above all other things. After all that she'd gone through, she still loved him at the end. Quite remarkable.
On the other hand, Henry saved his cruelest stroke till last. When Catherine died, he refused permission for her to be buried in Westminster Abbey, and even forbade Mary Tudor, their only daughter, from attending the funeral.
Catherine was buried by Robert Scarlett, the local gravedigger. Unfortunately, Scarlett has the rather dubious distinction of burying two queens in Peterborough Cathedral. The second was Mary, Queen of Scots, who spent her final days at nearby Fotheringay Castle.
Mary and Elizabeth I were cousins. Queen Elizabeth was increasingly under pressure to end the potential threat that Mary posed. As a legitimate rival for the throne, she was continually the centre of plots to seize the crown. For 18 years, she was kept as a virtual prisoner, but eventually, after the Babington plot of 1586, Elizabeth signed her cousin's death warrant at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire.
She was a very striking woman, very tall, about 6 feet, and with red hair. But when the executioner lifted her head, which had fallen onto the ground, a red wig came off. So obviously she had gone grey, and in the latter years been only apparently a red head.
Catherine of Aragon's tomb suffered badly at the hands of Cromwell's troops, but Mary's tomb escaped thanks to her son, James VI of Scotland and James I of England. He had his mother's remains transferred to Westminster Abbey.
While Peterborough and Ely are very different in many ways, they do have a few things in common. They're both royal foundations. Peterborough is marginally older and was established by Peter, King of Mercia. They were rebuilt by the Normans, both using stone quarried from Barnack near Stamford. They each had to have their central towers replaced, and today they stand in the same county, Cambridgeshire, the only one in England to have two cathedrals. What is more, on a clear day, they can see each other.
For centuries, these two great religious foundations were separated by the watery fens. Practically since man first tried to farm these parts, the challenge has been how to drain them.
Well, the fens always were water, always will be water. Way back, if you go back to the time of Queen Etheldreda and the foundation of the monasteries, they came here because we were a wild and watery landscape. Isolated, we wanted the solitude of being in our fen, in our lovely quiet fen with all our birds and butterflies and reeds.
In the 17th century, the first major scheme to drain the fens was primarily the brainchild of the Duke of Bedford, but local opposition was strong.
About 300 odd years ago, they dug a new river. The river. They said that would drain the fens. They'd spent so much money on it. 1637, they had a meeting in St Ives. They said, yes, that's drained, boy, you can have your land. Of course, what happened? Next year, that flooded, didn't it? The banks burst, all the water flooded all over. We told them shouldn't muck about, but see, they knew better.
The scheme was known to have the full support of Charles I.
However, Charles I's drainage plans brought him into direct conflict with the local population, and most especially Oliver Cromwell.
Cromwell strongly supported the Fenlanders' objections to these great plans, fearing loss of land and livelihoods. However, the Fens and their customs were to embroil these two men in a little-known saga which might have changed the course of history. In April 1646, King Charles I was attempting to travel through the Fens, which was a strongly parliamentarian area. He employed the assistance of a local man, Mucky Porter, as his guide. Porter was a member of a secret society whose sign was a split grey goose feather. Members were honour-bound to help the bearer of any such symbol. At one point, Porter and the king were stopped by a Roundhead patrol. Mucky Porter produced a feather, and the local soldiers allowed them to pass. Cromwell is claimed to have forgiven the patrol, saying that it was better for a king to escape than for a fenman not to help a man who had a split quill in his hand. The story doesn't end there, though. Apparently, the night before Charles was due to be beheaded, a split grey goose feather was sent to Oliver Cromwell. It made no difference. The following day, King Charles I was executed. Cromwell then received a number of bent or broken feathers, sent by men who felt he had betrayed his vows and was therefore no longer trustworthy.
Ironically, after Cromwell had objected so much to Charles's plans, no sooner had he become the Lord Protector than with the new Duke of Bedford he dug this much bigger river and completed the drainage of the fens.
The postscript to this tale relates to the King's Guide, Mucky Porter. After the restoration of the monarchy, Charles II sought out various people who had helped his father. One of them was Porter.
The new king asked him to choose whatever land he wanted, and having pointed out a bit, Charles asked him if he knew how many acres he thought it was. Well, Porter apparently replied, "Ooh, several I should think." And to this day, the area is known as the Severals and is still farmed by the Porters.
The drainage work under Cromwell took 4 years. In 1653, parts of the fens were declared dry.
What nobody realised was that when you take the water out, then the level goes down. And see, the problem was that the land levels kept dropping, but the river levels didn't. So you had to put the big banks up beside the rivers to keep the river water in. But then you had to have some way of pumping the water out the drains and up over these banks into the river. So then they had to start with windmills.
Initially, they were a great success. By the middle of the 18th century, there were almost 700 windmills in the fens. However, the age of the windmill was short. By the 1770s, dozens of them were abandoned to be replaced by steam engines. The need for pumps continues to this day, although now they're electric or diesel. For the fens is a classic example of man continually challenging the forces of nature. It may not look like much of a challenge, but every now and then, nature has a habit of reminding us what a risky business it is, as in 1947.
During March of that year, parts of England suffered very heavy snowfalls, followed by a sudden thaw. The River Ouse was already swollen with all this meltwater when they had to close the sluice gates at the sea because of an exceptionally high tide. The river began to rise, dangerously close to bursting point with all this water and nowhere for it to go.
As the water came across the fens, I could hear it spilling in the dikes. I can hear that sound now when I think about it. And there was, well, hares, rabbits, foxes, all those sort of things, what lived in the fens. They were all turned out in because of the water, you see. And they was all running in front of the water, crying with fear. I did actually have a fox run through my legs. He was so frightened of the water, you see. He didn't see no fear of nobody then. He just shot through my legs. And it was a sort of thing that, well, you'd never forget it, because it was something that you'd never imagine would happen. And I stood on the middle bridge in our particular fen, and I saw the water coming up, and it was up at the top of the bank as soon as it come. It was the drain was absolutely full and spilling over, and it hit the bridge, come through the 6-foot tunnel, and out the other side it went up in the air for at least, I'm not exaggerating, at least 30 feet. The pressure behind it forcing it through. Terrific sight. The water had so much power, it made the bridge crack, and eventually the water got in it, so it broke the bridge all up. It's rather frightening to see the power of water when you see it like that. In the house, there's fish, eels, rats, everything you could imagine. It came on the 14th day of March 1947, and it never cleared the fen completely clear until that following Christmas.
This great bank along the River Ouse is a permanent reminder of the fragile existence of this part of the country. Yet the fens remain one of the most fertile areas of Britain, and I doubt if there are many who rue the day the Crown set about draining them.
Most of the connections Anglia has with the Crown are associated with royal authority and patronage. There is, however, one place in a corner of Norfolk which has a much more personal relationship, where the Crown has directly influenced not just the country, but also shaped the community.
Ever since Sandringham was acquired in 1862 as a private home and estate, its story and character has inevitably reflected the individuals who've lived here, their tastes, style and interests, and none more so than its purchaser, King Edward VII, who was my great-great-grandfather. Most people would not really associate horses with Sandringham, least of all racehorses. Yet when this one, Persimmon, arrived in 1894, he was to have a most dramatic impact on both his owner and the estate.
When Edward VII was still Prince of Wales, he became interested in horse racing. It's almost inevitable that he would set up a stud on his newly acquired estate. In 1886, a royal stud at Sandringham was formed. Against advice, the prince bought an expensive mare called Perdita for 900 guineas. Acquiring Perdita was one of those opportunities of a lifetime, because in 1893 she gave birth to a foal called Persimmon.
When he was born, he was born at Welbeck, where his mother was going for another visit to St Simon. And the stud groom there said he was the most beautiful foal he'd ever seen. He was a magnificent specimen physically.
Persimmon won his first race at Ascot, and in the early days his career looked very rosy. But his build-up to the 1896 Derby was far from smooth. His form on the gallops was poor, he refused to get in his horse box, and had to be lifted bodily onto the Epsom-bound train.
When he arrived at Epsom, he apparently didn't look his best, and was reported when he was seen exercising on the course to be looking not too happy and sweating and that sort of thing. And it was a very, very high-class derby. I mean, every derby is very hard to win, and this was an exceptionally hard one to win because you had the winner of the 2,000 guineas, St Frisquin, who was a very good horse, and some other pretty hot contenders as well. Persimmon was lying about third, coming down that steep hill into the right-handed turn at Tatton Corner. And then St Frisquin went on, and it was a two-horse race from then on, virtually up the straight. And Persimmon, driven up to St Frisquin, just about got his head in front, seemed to falter. Jack Watts rode him a very clever race. He steadied him, got him balanced again, and drove him on. And a tremendous ding-dong battle all the way up to the line, and he just held on and won by, I think, a neck. So tremendous jubilation. Everybody got tremendously excited and deeply moved, to put it mildly. The whole thing was marvellous. And Prince of Wales gave an enormous dinner party to the Jockey Club at Marlborough House that night. He came to Sandringham to start his stud career the following year as a 5-year-old, and this box was built for him. and it's substantially unchanged since then. He's a tremendously successful stallion. He had only 10 years at stud because he fractured his hip when he was 15. But in those 10 years at stud, he produced 7 winners of 10 classic races. And he was champion sire 4 times, and his daughters made him champion broodmare sire 3 times. From his winnings and his stud earnings, the magnificent walled kitchen garden was built. And King Edward VII used to say that when he was showing people around in the garden, this is all persimmon. He said, everything here is all thanks to persimmon.
Long before persimmon, Sandringham had been the site of a house and small estate since the days of King Harold, even getting a mention in William the Conqueror's Doomsday Book. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had been looking for a suitable home for their eldest son and future daughter-in-law, Alexandra, for about a year. In 1862, Sandringham was bought for the Prince of Wales and his young bride-to-be.
They must have been a very happy young couple. They married when they were only 18 and 21 and moved to Sandringham and had this whole estate to play with almost, to create a wonderful home and also a glittering centre of society. When the house was first built, it had a lovely billiard room, which had been the conservatory of the original Sandringham Hall. Then, in the 1890s, a bowling alley was added, and I think perhaps when Prince Edward got a little older and wiser, he converted that into a library. Edward devoted most of his time to developing the estate, building the model farms, developing cottages for the workers, building a little hospital for them.
While Prince Albert Edward has left his mark all around Sandringham, once you step inside the house, there's little doubt as to who had the greater influence in here.
Princess Alexandra and her daughters, in particular, spent a great deal of time here and really made this their base. In this room, the drawing room, is a set of 6 beechwood painted chairs with the Prince of Wales feathers bound by a blue love knot. And I think that says an awful lot about the fact that they were a very happy young couple. The saloon is the lovely piano which Princess Alexandra had made in the same oak that the room is panelled in. In this room is a Broadwood piano, and in the ballroom is a Steinway, so I think there was a lot of singing went on around the piano. And this house was filled with the most wonderful people from all over the world, not just other members of the European royal families, to whom they were very closely related, but American guests and artists, writers, a lot of actors and actresses. They loved to use the house for theatrical entertainment. A lot of those actors and actresses became friends. And when they stayed in the house, not only did they sign the visitors' book, but their photographs were put into gilt screens as a sort of extra record, a sort of pictorial visitors' book. The people who came here were friends and family. It wasn't used for state entertaining. Just inside the front door, as guests and visitors come into the saloon, is a jockey's weighing stool. It is rather unusual, and it was a birthday present to Prince Edward. It was used to weigh guests when they arrived for a weekend, and then they were weighed when they left, and they should have put on weight over a weekend. And there was competition between the great houses of England at that time, who all employed the finest French chefs, to put weight on their visitors. And they competed against one another. And when you look in the dining room at the size of menu, the number of courses that they ate, no wonder they put on weight. I think it has the most lovely family-friendly atmosphere, and the house is kept very much as Edward and Alexandra left it. The portraits are the same. The ornaments in the rooms are the ones that Edward and Alexandra collected. It really is very much still their house. We have photographs of a house party gathered on the steps of Sandringham House, and there probably were 30 to 40 people. The house was a lot bigger in those days. A wing was demolished in the 1970s, and it's now only 274 rooms. And of course, Park House had been built in the grounds, and York Cottage. And York Cottage was originally called Bachelor's Cottage, and it was for the overflow of the male guests, and they would stay down there.
Even today, it's not difficult to see what must have attracted the Prince of Wales to this part of the country. The fact that there is still an abundance of trees and hedgerows should not detract from the point that Sandringham is very much a working estate, with 3 commercial farms growing a wide variety of crops and fruit. But you can't go far without seeing some legacy from the Prince of Wales's time here. This water tower, which dominates much of the local area, was built in 1877 in order to improve the water supply to the house after Edward contracted typhoid.
The water tower is just one of many examples of Edward VII's influences all around Sandringham, for his energy was also directed at the welfare of the people who lived on the estate. Like this village club, his legacy has lasted for generations.
I went to West Newton School until I was 14. And when I left, I went to the carving school, which was known in those days as Queen Alexandra's Technical School of Woodwork. She started that to teach boys on the estate of trade. And it was like that until the end of the First World War. In King George V's time, when they was here for the Christmas trip, they was here probably about 6 weeks. And whoever the rector was, he used to take the service the first Sunday and the last. But in between, they used to have a special preacher every Sunday. And in those days, King George V and Queen Mary with their guests used to walk from Sandringham House through the gardens up to the stud and the carving school, and Mr. Burnham had to be up there and open the carving school. They used to have a look round the furniture, and whatever the rector, whoever he was, wanted, he could have it, and the king used to give it to him as a present for preaching that Sunday. From 1937 up till the time I retired in 1974, driving the estate car used to go all around, you know, the estate, and sometimes have a trip to Windsor Castle or down to the palace, and when the Queen was in residence here, used to fetch the stuff from the station and all that sort of thing.
Sandringham was more than just an estate. It was a whole community. The King's company of soldiers, its own schools, and its own fire service, which Jack Benstead commanded for over 16 years. Nowadays, the Royal Brigade at Sandringham has gone, It's been incorporated into the Norfolk Fire Service. In its last years, the brigade was restricted to fighting mainly heath fires. But the heaths themselves and the shape of the surrounding countryside have largely been defined by a different pastime. One associated most strongly with Sandringham: shooting.
It must have been very much an outdoor life. Traditionally, Prince Edward and Princess Alexandra arrived just before his birthday, the 9th of November, and stayed at Sandringham through until February. And of course, the shooting and the hunting locally was the great activity, and the shooting did increase in its quality, and they would go out and put up great marquees for the lunch and have liveried footmen serving lunch, which must have been quite grand and quite a spectacle. Of course, the tradition of Sandringham time was based on that all the clocks at Sandringham were half an hour forward to have extra daylight for shooting. And that tradition went on until the 1930s.
There was nothing to get 1,000 birds a day. About 12 and 14 guns shooting, you know. And King George V was a very good shot too, one of the best shots in the country. The Prince of Wales, he said to old Bland, the head gamekeeper, now Bland, he said, never put me next to my father, because he said, if my father's on my right and I shoot to the right, he accuses me of pinching his birds. He said, if I shoot to my left, he said, I'm letting the birds go, so he said, I can't win, so never put me next to my father. We were shooting at Congham, and he put him next to his father. And he called old Bland over, he said, Bland, you're a bloody fool, you should have been strangled at birth. Ere heavens, he said, take my gun, I'm going home. And he walked on from Congham and went out riding. That was the Prince of Wales and old Bland, the head gamekeeper. He wasn't very popular.
Who, Bland or the Prince of Wales?
No, Bland.
King Edward was a great enthusiast for new technology. He introduced the telephone and electric light into the house. Both he and Alexandra loved cars, and this 1900 Daimler Phaeton was the first car ever to be owned and driven by a member of the royal family.
After her first journey in the Daimler, Queen Alexandra wrote to George, the Duke of York, on June the 28th, 1901, I did so enjoy being driven about in the cool of the evening at 50 miles an hour. And I must say, I have the greatest confidence in our driver. I poke him violently in the back at every corner to go gently whenever a dog, a child, or anything else comes in our way. There are other vintage cars in the museum, but considerably smaller. These toy cars show the affinity a succession of generations have enjoyed with the automobile. The King and Queen also loved their dogs, and judging by the paintings and memorials in the grounds, they had plenty of them. One of Edward's favourites was Caesar. He was a wire-haired terrier and was renowned for attacking guests and supposedly biting their ankles. Caesar survived his master and even followed the king's coffin at his funeral. The little dog has been immortalised, lying at his master's feet on Edward VII's tomb. On the first anniversary of Edward VII's death, an American admirer, Rodman Wanamaker, presented this altar to Queen Alexandra on the 6th of May 1911. The cross and candlesticks were given by the king's household. The altar is one of many of the small parish church of Sandringham's more spectacular features given by Wanamaker to Queen Alexandra. For instance, this Bible, donated in 1915, is set with over 500 precious and semi-precious stones and weighs nearly 28 pounds. The church itself is much older than it appears, dating back to the 14th century, but it was substantially rebuilt in the 16th. Each memorial in the church tells a story. The pulpit was the last of Wanamaker's gifts, presented in 1924 on Queen Alexandra's 80th and last birthday. The processional cross was presented also by Wanamaker in 1920 in commemoration of the men of Sandringham Estate who died during the First World War.
George VI was christened here and, like his father, died at Sandringham. And while this parish church makes an ideal setting for such private family matters, the wider public role has meant that none of my family is buried here, but rather at Windsor.
However, there are two exceptions to this rule. Princes Alexander and John both died in infancy and are buried here. Alexander was Edward and Alexandra's youngest, who died the day after he was born in 1871. John was the youngest of George and Mary, who survived until 1919. He was just 14 years old.
In spite of the incessant conflict of public role and private life, Sandringham does retain certain traditions, which started here.
Since the days of Edward VII, Sandringham has been the traditional gathering place for the royal family at Christmas. Another tradition has sprung up alongside, that of the Christmas broadcast. The first was in 1932 by George V, which he opened with, "I speak now from my home and from my heart to you all."
However, the most famous was probably that of my grandfather, George VI. Every speech or broadcast was a major challenge for him as he suffered from a stammer. Nevertheless, in the dark days of 1939 and the first Christmas at war, he quoted from a poem by Haskins.
I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown. And he replied, go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than light and safer than a known way.
Another tradition is much less well known. The Sandringham Flower Show has been going since 1881. For over 50 years, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, has been attending the show every summer. In spite of the crowds of visitors, well-wishers and tourists, the event is still very much a local affair, and the focus of Queen Elizabeth's attention are the villagers and estate staff.
While many of the features of Sandringham reflect its past, its traditions and its history, there are two important things to remember about the place. Firstly, it's a thoroughly modern working estate and always has been. And secondly, this is the story of a home and not a palace, which continues to grow and evolve over time. There are few places that are better able to reflect the true concerns and interests of the Crown towards the country.